It's been almost 100 years now since the lakes and rivers last echoed with the songs of the voyageurs. Gone are the 40-foot canoes of birch bark, but the art of paddling is still very much alive. The canoe is no longer a vehicle of trade and commerce. It has become instead the means of exploring or rediscovering what is left of the natural world. You won't find many people traveling alone nowadays. The lone trapper or prospector has given way to the pleasure canoeist, paddling double or in groups for companionship and safety. But learning to paddle solo is still fundamental to the art of canoeing. Paddling positions vary with wind, waves, and rapids. The most stable position is kneeling amidships, braced against the bow seat. By sliding over to the gunwale into the cruising position, paddling is made easier. But the wide kneel is safest in waves and rapids. For long distances, though, the cruising position is much more relaxing. To rest the legs, alternate one leg out. And there's nothing wrong with sitting on the seat for relaxation. Sitting on the heels in the center of the canoe is painful until you get used to it, but provides maximum control. The pivot point of the canoe is located directly beneath the canoeist. Kneeling amidships makes it possible to control the canoe with either bow or stern strokes. A turning stroke should be applied as far forward or back from the pivot point as possible. The most difficult thing about paddling is to make the canoe go in a straight line. A forward stroke causes the canoe to veer away from the paddling side. To compensate, most people change sides every few strokes. The canoe can be more easily steered by doing a pry at the end of each stroke. Most people turn the paddle in towards the canoe and pry away. It's been nicknamed the goon stroke. For flat water paddling, there are 4 ways to do it better. First, the J stroke. The power face of the paddle, which is the side that pulls against the water, turns out away from the canoe. The path of the paddle describes a J. The difference is very subtle. Here it is again. The goon stroke. The power face of the paddle turns in. The J stroke. The power face turns out, away from the canoe. The thumb on the upper hand turns down if you're doing it right. The paddle is rotated freely in the lower hand. Paddling is made easier by sitting close to the gunwale, and the steering is more effective if the paddle is pried off the gunwale. To turn towards the paddle side, increase the pry away at the stern and hold the paddle in the water longer. With the J, steering takes place at the end of the stroke. Now try knifing the paddle forward underwater during the recovery. Steering is accomplished by pulling up on the blade. Steering takes place during the recovery. It's called the Canadian stroke. It's harder to learn, but a relaxing and beautiful stroke. To make a turn towards the paddling side, angle the paddle deeper in the water and pull up harder during recovery. As with the J stroke, the paddle can be pried off the gunwale, or it can be done without touching the gunwale. Now try turning the paddle early in the forward stroke and continue the rolling action throughout. It's called the pitch because of the angling of the blade throughout the power stroke. By pitching the blade early, steering is accomplished during the power stroke. With just the right amount of pitch, the canoe will follow a dead straight course with very little effort wasted in steering. It's a fast, efficient stroke, but not as relaxing as the Canadian. Now try knifing the blade forward underwater and rotate the paddle in the upper hand to begin the next power stroke. The paddle remains in the water and makes one revolution per stroke, and steering takes place during the entire stroke. It's called the Indian stroke. If done slowly and carefully, there is no sound from the paddle. By drawing in as the paddle comes around to the bow, you can make a powerful inside turn. Once again, the 4 strokes. The J stroke. Steering is accomplished at the end of the stroke. The Canadian. Steering is accomplished during the recovery. The pitch. Steering is accomplished during the power stroke. The Indian stroke. Steering can be accomplished during the entire stroke. To turn away from the paddle side, just do a power stroke. To turn sharper, sweep the paddle wide to increase the arc of the blade from the pivot point. To turn even more violently, jam the paddle in at the bow at an angle. Sliding the lower hand up the shaft increases the reach, making pries, draws, and sweeps more effective. The bow jam, followed by a series of pries, will pivot the canoe on the spot. Using one hand is also effective, and it adds a little class to the maneuver. The pivot can be continued by knifing the paddle to the stern and drawing in. Then pry out at the bow and in at the stern. The paddle remains parallel to the canoe and describes a rectangle. It's called the box stroke. To pivot in the opposite direction, the stroke is reversed by drawing in at the bow and prying out at the stern. Now smooth the stroke out into one graceful motion and lean the canoe right to the gunwale. The cross draw is sometimes preferable to the bow pry for turning away from the paddle side. The cross draw can be followed by a power sweep. When underway, the momentum of the canoe increases the turning effect. But the degree of difficulty also increases. For a power turn to the paddle side, do an Indian stroke with strong emphasis on the draw in at the bow. The canoe responds quicker to bow strokes than stern because the bow rides higher. Power turns can be used for landing on difficult shorelines. The bow pry, followed by a stern draw. For running rapids, turns and pivots are often replaced by a side-slipping motion. Reach out at a 90-degree angle from the canoe and pull the paddle directly towards the body. For an underwater recovery, the paddle can be sliced away from the canoe. The draw is a good stroke, but the sculling draw is better. Knife the paddle back and forth, angled against the water. The path of the paddle resembles a figure of 8. The sculling draw is an effective and powerful stroke for side-slipping in rapids. To side-slip the canoe away from the paddle side, pry off the gunwale. The pry must be done right beside the body or the canoe will turn. Reverse sculling accomplishes the same thing. It's similar to the sculling draw, but the angle of the paddle is reversed. The paddle is high to reveal the angle of the blade. but the stroke should be done deep in the water. Draws and pries done under power increase the effectiveness of the strokes. To side slip towards the paddle side, hold the paddle at a 45-degree angle. As momentum slows, begin the scull draw to continue the side slipping. To side slip away from the paddle side, hold the pry at the opposite angle. As momentum slows, begin the pry strokes. The angle of the blade is controlled by the upper hand. Side slipping avoids the possibility of broadsiding onto a rock in rapids. To make the canoe go backward under control, draw in at the stern and roll the power face out. It's a reverse J. The power face turns out. For moving slowly in rapids, backsculling is used because of the stability gained by leaning the weight on the paddle. The strokes can be put together in various combinations to maintain control in wind and rapids. A strong draw in at the bow, a power stroke with a heavy J, and an underwater recovery will pull the canoe around into an inside turn, regardless of how strong the wind is blowing. A gust of wind hits the bow. A strong draw counteracts. The stroke propels the canoe forward, and a heavy J continues the turn into the wind. The upper hand rotates on the grip. The paddle knifes forward, holding the canoe on course despite the wind. The most effective stroke for turning the canoe around into the wind is the bow pry, or bow jam. Because of the mechanical advantage of the pry, the canoe can be levered around into the strongest of winds. Paddling on the lee side of the canoe this time, the bow jam holds the canoe from being blown downwind. A series of bow pries levers the bow around into the wind and holds steady. The canoe is like a weather vane. The high end will always swing downwind. By sitting ahead of the center thwart, the stern rides high and blows downwind, making it possible to hold the bow into the wind. When traveling with a load, position it as close to the center as possible. Keeping the bow and stern light and buoyant avoids the problem of waves breaking over the bow and stern. The gear is stowed forward in the bow, and the canoeist kneels in the stern when traveling in a light wind. A very comfortable position when traveling solo with a load. Wilderness canoeing is a creative art. The paddling positions and endless combinations of strokes harmonize with the ever-changing moods. Another skill demanded of the wild river canoeist is the ability to predict the degree of difficulty of a rapid. By studying the surface from shore, the canoeist can tell where the rocks are and if there is a navigable channel through them. It's called reading the rapids, a subject that will be dealt with in the next film. First, the strokes must be mastered, along with an understanding of how to use them in rapids. The backwater makes possible a slow descent of the rapids without turning broadside. It buys time to choose a course and position the canoe. The sculling draw side slips the canoe across the current towards the paddle side. The pry stroke side slips the canoe away from the paddle side. Side slipping gets you to shore without turning broadside to the current. Comes in handy when you don't like what you see up ahead. The Indian stroke maintains control with a constant racing effect. Leaning bow draw turn, a powerful maneuver to pull the canoe out of the mainstream into an eddy. The cross bow not only turns the canoe away from the paddle side, but also slows the forward momentum of the canoe. The flat brace. By leaning the weight out on the blade, the effective width of the canoe increases from 3 feet to 6 feet because the paddle acts as an outrigger. The stabilizing effect can keep the canoe upright through extremely difficult water. The success of the brace depends on transferring your weight out onto the paddle. brace, the most stable position for difficult rapids. A canoeist traveling a wild river requires all the strokes, regardless of whether rapids are run or portaged. The approach to the portage can be extremely dangerous and demands considerable skill in making a controlled landing. Every year, canoeists are killed by being swept over falls or into rapids they had no intention of running. Just downstream from here, a man drowned. He drowned because he missed the landing. The power of falling water can be terrifying, but the rapids and falls of the Precambrian Shield are the essence of wilderness, the life and spirit of the land. No craft ever designed was better suited for this vast network of waterways, and no art more demanding than the art of paddling a canoe in wind, waves, and rapids. Square miles of rock-bound wilderness. That was the barrier that confronted the early explorers. They didn't waste much time adapting to the Indian canoe in their conquest of the land. And 300 years later, it's still the best way of getting around out here.
Deeper over on the right, Paul. You think we can squeeze her through there?
Yeah.
Paddle forward. Good. Just set her right in there.
Wow! Ever nice.
Rock coming up on the right.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, and we only hit once there.
The rapids and falls still bar the way to this hidden world, but they are no longer an obstruction to be cursed, as they were in the days of the voyageur. It is because of the rapids and falls that these hidden places exist today, cut off from the modern world.
Well, you're old enough to carry this thing. Hey! Why didn't you tell me that rock was there?
There's no way we're gonna see a deer with all that racket.
It doesn't cost all that much to be here, but wilderness travel can be difficult, and there are risks. Running rapids will always be a calculated risk, but risk diminishes with skill and knowledge.
What's that?
Let's grab that eddy. Channel's way over to the right. Think we can make it?
Looks okay to me.
I'll tell you when to begin the draw.
Let's go.
The canoeists, not the river, decide the course of the canoe. By doing an eddy turn into the still water behind a rock, they buy time to appraise the water ahead and plan strategy. Just one of the many maneuvers that make the running of rapids under control possible.
Harder. More backwater.
When you ride a wild river, there's a sense of freedom that has almost been forgotten from our distant past. You become a part of your canoe, a part of the land, and a part of all that has gone before. The art of canoeing has come down to us through the centuries from the native peoples, each generation adding to the skill of the last. Even today, paddling techniques are still improving. Paddling does not come naturally. Like any skill, it must be learned. The first problem to overcome is the tendency of the canoe to veer away from the stern paddler's side. It's the stern paddler's job to correct this without losing power in the stroke. The bow paddler mainly supplies power. The strength of the stroke comes through the use of the whole body. The paddle is brought back flat to cut wind resistance. A short stroke is more efficient than a long one. There are three basic strokes for paddling a straight line. First, the J stroke. At the end of the stroke, the power face of the paddle, which is the side that pulls against the water, turns out. Without instruction, most people pry with the wrong side of the paddle. They turn the power face in towards the canoe and pry out. This is called the stern pry or goon stroke, and is inefficient for paddling a straight line. To do the J properly, roll the power face out and pry away. The power face turns out, away from the canoe. If you're doing it right, the thumb on the upper hand will point down at the end of the stroke. With the J, the steering action takes place at the end of the stroke. To do the Canadian stroke, roll the power face out, knife the paddle back underwater, and pull up. The force exerted upwards as the paddle knifes forward provides the steering action. With the Canadian stroke, the steering takes place during the recovery. It's a relaxing and beautiful stroke. The third steering stroke is called the pitch. The rolling out of the power face begins early, with the paddle leaving the water at the end of the power stroke. With the pitch stroke, the steering is accomplished during the power stroke. It's a fast, efficient stroke, though not as relaxing as the Canadian. When any one of these strokes is applied with extra force on the push or pry away, the canoe turns toward the stern paddler's side. The bow paddler can assist in the turn by shortening his power stroke and doing a pry off the gunwale. To turn away from the stern paddler's side, a sweep is used. The bow does a diagonal draw. Reaching out at 45 degrees, the paddle is drawn towards the body, pulling the canoe around into the turn. To turn even sharper, reach out to 90 degrees and draw straight towards the body. By working together as a team, the canoe can be moved aggressively into tight turns without slowing down. If the bow and stern paddlers both do a draw stroke or a pry stroke, the canoe will rotate at a point halfway between the two canoeists. It's called the pivot point. To pivot towards the bowman's side, both paddlers do a draw. The sculling draw accomplishes the same thing, but with the paddle remaining in the water, the stroke is more stable. The paddle is knifed back and forth, angled against the water. To pivot in the opposite direction, both paddlers do the pry. An alternative stroke for the bow paddler is to do a cross draw. After mastering the stationary pivots, they are then attempted when moving. First, the pry. The most difficult part of the pry turn is getting just the right angle on the paddle and bracing against the gunwale. pry turn can be used for a violent turn into an eddy. When making a landing, the pry is delayed as long as possible, so the canoe completes the turn close to shore. The power turn towards the bow paddler's side. As momentum slows, follow with a series of draws. The stern does a sweep. The bow draw pivot is the safest stroke for making a turn into an eddy behind a rock. The bow draw landing. The bow draw pivot above a rapid is a fast way to get to shore. The upstream paddler gets out first and holds. The alternative to the pry turn is the cross bow draw. The stern does a pry. The cross draw is safer than the pry for making an eddy turn in rapids. The paddle can be kept close to the surface to avoid catching a rock.
Way to go, Paul. That was great. You brought it around beautifully.
The cross bow draw landing. On a difficult shoreline, the bow paddler positions the stern for easy access to the landing. To side-slip or move the canoe laterally, the bow and stern do opposite strokes. The bow a pry, the stern a draw. To go the other way, the bow does a draw, the stern a pry. The sculling draw does the same thing, but with more stability. The paddle remains in the water. As an alternative to the pry, the bow can do a cross bow draw. Side-slipping under power increases the degree of difficulty. Side-slipping to shore avoids broadsiding onto a shallow rock.
What do you think of it, Paul?
Not bad, but I think we should look it over.
The upstream end of the canoe must touch shore before the downstream end. Otherwise, the current will swing the canoe around out of control.
It doesn't look too bad.
In a current, the canoe is side-slipped at an angle with the stern paddler leading the way.
A little harder. She's coming up fast.
Side-slipping away from the bow paddler's side. The bow a pry, the stern a draw. As momentum slows, a series of pries follows. The stern paddler does the sculling draw.
Hang on. Right. Lean on it.
place of the pry, the crossbow draw can be used.
Maybe we can get it from there.
The stability of the canoe can be increased by leaning the weight out on the paddle in a flat brace, or a high brace. As momentum slows, the paddle sinks, so must be sculled to keep it up on the surface. The paddle acts like an outrigger on each side of the canoe, a very stable position for running rapids. The standing position improves the view ahead in shallow water or when approaching rapids. The paddle is kept in the water and sculled to provide balance and steerage. When approaching rapids, standing increases the visibility over the brink. The kneeling canoeist braces for extra stability. The improved view makes it easier to appraise the rapids and line up on the deep water if they are to be run. If there is any doubt, the rapids are viewed from shore. It's possible to know where the rocks lie and where the safe passage is, if any, by observing the surface. It's called reading the rapids. It will be dealt with in the next film. The backwater, one of the most important strokes in modern rapid running techniques. The stern paddler draws or pries the canoe in the desired direction, while the bowman follows with reverse jays, diagonal draws, and pries to control his end. The backwater and backsculling makes it possible to move slower than the current, to buy time to maneuver and choose the course.
Take her slow, Paul.
Okay, over to the right.
A little harder. Let me get my end over. Good, the angle's about right. Keep her going. Draw.
By combining a backwater with a draw or pry, it is possible to ferry the canoe across the river. To do this maneuver properly, the canoe must not ride deeper in the stern.
Hey, you're outpulling me.
The canoeists work as a team, being careful not to outpull each other.
Okay, let her go.
When the canoe is in position, the downstream run begins.
We have to hang tight to the right until we're about halfway down, then we have to back very left.
The ability to maintain complete control of the canoe by means of the many paddle strokes makes it possible to venture down rivers that would be otherwise dangerous.
Good, lots of backwater. Great, I have all the time in the world.
That wasn't as bad as it looked.
When paddling in waves, the canoe can be stabilized by moving into the center, where it is 3 feet wide instead of only 1.5 feet near the bow and stern. The unweighted bow and stern bobs easily in the troughs without shipping water. In lake travel, one is almost sure to encounter large waves at one time or another. By practicing with an onshore wind and good life jackets, a wipeout would only mean a swim to shore. Relax and lean into the waves, not away from them. As in rapids, it is necessary to read the water and memorize the shoals where only the big waves break. A breaking wave is about the only thing a canoe can't ride.
That was wild.
Here,
would be very dangerous to try this off a point, where an upset would result in being swept out into a large expanse of water. It's much better to learn the art of paddling in wind, waves, and rapids in a controlled situation than to try to learn when things get difficult unexpectedly on a canoe trip.
But I'm starving.
We're all starving.
At the base of these cliffs, weary voyageurs once stopped to rest and smoke their pipes as they paddled and sang their way along the shore of Superior. Their 40-foot canoes of birch bark were the ancestors of the wide variety of canoes we know today. The modern-day voyageur is faced with a bewildering array of canoes from which to choose. The problem is how to pick a good one. The canvas-covered cedar canoe, only one generation removed from the small birch bark canoe of the Indian, is still the most aesthetically pleasing canoe of all. Aluminum and fiberglass canoes are best suited for those who are mainly interested in a no-maintenance functional canoe. Some models with their flat bottoms are very safe, but lack in the aesthetic qualities. Some of the best designs are to be found in the canvas cedar canoes like this Prospector model. 5 meters is an average length. A slight rocker to the keel line makes for fast pivot turns in rapids. A continuous curve to the gunwale from bow to stern is desirable. Gunwales that drop too soon allow waves to spill in over the bow. A cross-section of this canoe reveals adequate tumble home. That's the sloping in of the gunwales near the top, necessary for easy, relaxed paddling. To provide adequate freeboard with an average load, the canoe should be 91 centimeters wide amidships and at least 35 centimeters deep. The cedar canoe is, it must be admitted, heavier and more fragile than the aluminum, fiberglass, and plastic canoes. Gone is the beautiful curve of the gunwale of this battered and patched old canvas-covered canoe. Every cracked rib and broken plank, a reminder of past adventures. The canoe is more than just a means of getting around on water. It is a link with the past. And when you paddle a canoe, you journey with those who have gone before.
It's the feeling of floating down a peaceful, lazy river. It's an express lane to escape and relaxation. It's a one-way ticket to canoeing paradise. So pick up your paddle and glide away. Take the front seat. Feel the exhilaration of whitewater. Let your spirit soar. Jump into some mad river fun and share every action-packed second of it with your family and friends. It's an adventure in living. It's a feeling of being alive. So let yourself go down a river in a mad river canoe. You'll never be the same again because we're serious about building the best canoes you'll ever experience.